Richard Perkins Hsung was born in China and was one of the first teens to leave China legally after Mao's Cultural Revolution. He earned a Ph.D. in chemistry from the University of Chicago and became a professor at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the University of Wisconsin-Madison, retiring in 2022 to focus solely on completing his mother's memoir. In today's episode, Richard discusses his mother's memoir, Spring Flower, which chronicles the incredible life of his mother, Dr. Jean Tren-Hwa Perkins, MD. Welcome to Lifeology.
Yeah, thank you so much, James, for having me on your show.
I am really honored that you are on my show. Just reading the information about your mother and even about you, I was blown away. I mean, there's so much resilience that's in this story. So I'm really looking forward to hearing more about it. Before we get started, though, how is it for you to be able to complete your mother's work? So she had this incredible life, and then you retired from your professorship to finish this memoir. How is that for you to find that completion of the work?
It was an exhausting process. I made a promise to her about 11 years ago while she was dying in a nursing home. And I said I would do my best to complete your memoir. And I know at the time she had already stopped writing for about a decade or more. And so I didn't know what I was getting into until she passed away and handed me these 1,000 pages of manuscript and notes. Gosh. And then ultimately it led to my, early retirement just so I can focus on completing the memoir. Yeah.
It's quite a promise you gave. Like you said, not knowing what it is, but of course it's your mother. So of course you're going to do it.
Yes. I had to. She would be really mad. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. That's hysterical. Now, your mother had a very interesting life. So when she was born, walk us through that. So when she was born, what happened there?
Yes, she was born in 1931, and right around the time when the Yangtze River, which is where her town was next to, had one of the biggest flood in centuries, and perhaps it was one of the worst natural disaster in the 20th century. And it killed actually upwards of 4 million people. And so she miraculously lived because her biological parents tried to find a home for her, because they couldn't afford having a mouth to feed. And they found my American grandparents who were who were medical missionaries at the time in a town directly from her town, across the river. And so my mother was adopted when she was about 10 months old by Americans.
Wow. So she doesn't obviously remember her biological parents. So when she was with medical missionaries and they're from the U.S., you said. So was English and Chinese or Mandarin? Was that her first language? Their first languages?
Yeah. So she was raised in an American family and surrounded by Western missionaries. Even though the broader surrounding was this impoverished China, right? War torn, famine-stricken China. And then, so she spoke English since she was 10 months old, 1 year old, and naturally thought she was American, and English was her first, if not native language. Yep.
Wow, that's so interesting.
Right. Right. Just like kids were born overseas, military kids and missionary kids. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Wow. So but her citizenship was Chinese, correct?
Yes, but she was legally adopted in U.S. Supreme Court, stationed in China, in Shanghai in 1940. And so technically, she was supposedly American citizen from that point on. But yeah.
So what left from there? So first off, the type of missionaries that her medical missionaries, what kind of doctors were they?
Yeah, so my American grandfather was a surgeon specialized in infectious diseases. And my American grandmother was born and raised actually in Edinburgh. And so they were married in 1916, just about 15 years prior to adopting my mother. They wanted to dedicate their lives to Christian mission. And so they chose Asia, ultimately ended up in China. And so before they adopted my mom, they were already in that town for 15 years, and they built actually a hospital using their own resources. Wow. And trying to help all kinds of people in dire strait, I guess. And so 1931, they adopted my mom And then I
Wow.
guess we sort of touched upon the fact that my mother also lived in the States during World War II.
Mhm.
So during
Mhm.
World War II, my mother came to America with her parents.
Mm. Wow. Oh, okay. So when she left, there obviously was no struggle with her for leaving China once they returned to the U.S.
Yeah, no, not at all. Because
Okay, good,
I
good.
mean,
Yeah, yeah. I
English
was
is
just making sure. Yeah,
good. Yeah, so
yeah,
she,
yeah. Of course, yeah.
even though it was still a little bit of cultural shock, right? Because the surrounding was in Yonkers,
Yeah.
New York, and New York City instead of
Oh goodness,
impoverished
yeah,
China. But in
yes,
terms of language, culturally, yeah, she
yeah,
fit it right in, and she was about to become this all-American teenager during the
yeah.
1940s. Yes. Mhm.
Wow, wow. What I can't imagine the culture shock she must have experienced from there. So, but did she know that she always wanted to be? Well, she was an ophthalmologist, correct? Did she know she always wanted to be that?
No, she wanted to become a writer, become an author, to write books, or become a journalist when she
Uh-huh.
was attending junior high school in Yonkers, New York. But
Uh-huh.
when the war ended, my American grandparents wanted to go back to China, continue their mission work.
Mhm.
And so they uprooted her and took her back to China with them.
Mm.
And so then a few years later, a Korean War broke out. Essentially, that was a war between America and China on the
Mhm.
Korean Peninsula. And so my American grandparents were driven out of China overnight. And
Mm. Oh,
because
wow.
anti-American fervor was at all-time high.
Yeah, yeah.
And my mother was trapped in China. And so she had to live for the next 30 years in China before coming back to America in 1980. At that time, she brought
Wow.
me to the States. Right.
Wow. So they had your grandparents had to flee overnight. You said. Where was your mother at that time? Was she with them?
She
What
was
was
a
she in the
freshman in an
city?
English-speaking college, about 300
Oh.
miles away from them, and she couldn't make it back. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, I can't imagine what that'd be like to have your family gone and then you're now stuck in a country that's not your country. Did she speak? Did she speak Chinese as well? Or Mandarin? I don't know.
But
There's so
she
many
was a
languages. That-
foreigner, essentially a foreigner in her own birth country, right? So she had a
Wow,
terrible American accent whenever she spoke Chinese,
I bet.
and
Yeah,
she had to work on that over the next 30 years of her life trapped in China.
yeah.
Yeah, it was
But
very
30
difficult.
years. Yeah, 30 years. Wow. What did she do during What did she do during those 30 years?
Yeah, so lo and behold, there were a lot of people came out of woodwork to help her out in some ways. They sort of figured
Mm-hmm.
that she wasn't from here, even though she looked Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so, actually, first order of business was a Chinese government, the communist central government. They decided that they need two professions. One is teachers, the other is physician. And so they split all the kids in college at the time and told them your tuition will be waived, free, and room and board will be provided if you would choose one of these two professions. And then
Yeah.
somehow she got shuffled into a medical school and then eventually ended up becoming a ophthalmologist. And
Wow.
that profession actually helped save her.
How so?
Well, during the 1960s, Mao launched one of the
Mhm.
worst man-made disasters called the Cultural Revolution. Essentially, it was a cultural genocide, right?
Yeah.
Specifically targeting highly creative and highly educated people. And my mother was one of them. And also they were targeting people with connections and relations to the Western world. My mom
Mm.
was brought up by Americans and had a
Yeah.
religious background. So she was at the
Yeah.
top of the persecution list. Yeah.
Wow. And so when they were ready to have the genocide, what happened? How was she saved?
She was lucky because she was a physician, and I don't care
Oh,
what
because that.
religion
Okay.
it is, that they need hospitals,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
They need competent physicians. They need to have functional
Yeah.
hospitals still, right? And
Yes.
also,
Yes. Yes.
she was fortunate because my father was the first one. Got sent to jail, and actually a Stalinist labor camp. He was also a professor at a research institute, and so he was the first wave of people being sent
Oh
away.
gosh. Yeah.
And then so they actually thought, well, okay, there are two kids at home. One is already gone. You can't send the other one to jail either, right? So
Yeah.
so then they allowed her to stay working in the hospital, even though she went through numerous reform rustication programs. So essentially,
Wow.
my older sister and I grew up on our own. for our first 10 years for my first 10 years of my life. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. How much older is your sister than you?
She's 6 years of my senior. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So she was almost like your parent, and when your mother was away, of course, she was almost like your parent in some ways as you grew.
Yes,
As you were
but
raised.
unfortunately, she suffered from a cerebral palsy, so she's
Oh
actually
goodness.
physically
Okay.
challenged. So I was the man of
Hmm.
the house, actually.
I see that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
With your father, if I may ask, with your father being sent away, was he was sent to jail or was he executed? I don't mean to be
My
was
father,
he executed?
my father was at a labor camp for about 6 years, and he was initially
Okay.
actually on the execution list because he had criticized the government 10 years earlier in the 1950s.
No.
So 1960s, when the revolution broke out, he was the first one
Yeah.
on the list. And then came to my mother's name, and then they realized, okay, well, you are a competent, actually highly skilled ophthalmologist. Maybe we could use you for at some point. So why don't you stay? And you have two kids. One is physically challenged, and so you're allowed to stay most of the time.
I see.
To
Okay.
raise your family. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Okay. And after the 10 years, was he released?
So my
Or 6 years
father,
rather?
from mid 1960s to about early 1970s. So he was released early 1970s, and I didn't know who the heck he was at the
I
time.
bet. Yeah.
Yeah, he probably saw me for the first time after I was born. I was born at the onset of the revolution.
Oh wow. So
Yeah.
wow, that is. How is this for you? I mean, hearing this, first off, thank you so much. I know you wrote this in this memoir, but people who have never experienced what your family's experienced. I mean, trauma is trauma. However,
Yeah.
your situation, it's. I'm just very honored that you're on my show today. For you to read this and to learn all this more information, even get to know your dad when you were younger. How is it for you? How did that determine who you are? I mean, what's your identity? If I may ask.
Yes, that's a great question. I think I was too young to understand the gravity of the situation. Except
Yeah.
I knew I had to help my mother out and take care of my sister, helping my sister. And then that was my main focus at the
Uh-huh,
time in the
uh-huh.
early 1970s when I actually
Yeah.
was old enough.
Yeah.
But it was really working on my mother's memoir, looking back on that part of history. That was atrocious. One of the
Yeah.
worst time in the modern Chinese history, but maybe
Hmm.
in history of mankind.
Yeah.
Millions were persecuted, and maybe even over 1 million people died during the process. It's no worse than what Stalin did to Russians in the
Yeah. Yes.
1930s, 40s, and 50s. Right? So it was actually reflecting back. I understood much more than I was
Mm-hmm.
at the time. I was too young to understand.
Yeah, which I'm sure was a blessing in that respect to be that young, to not really be able to understand what was happening. So, like you said,
Yeah,
when you're
yes,
older, you can
ignorance is a
retrospectively.
bliss. Yes.
Yes, it is. Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it is.
Mhm.
How is it for your mom, for your mother and your father to reconnect? I mean, I don't know if you have any memories of that, but kind of reading back at that, and I'm sure your mother talks about that in her memoir, Spring Flower is the name of the book. How is it for them to reconnect when they saw each other again after all those years?
Yeah, so I think there was some true love between two of them, but I think
Yeah.
the part of their marriage was sort of marriage of convenience, kind of like in
Hmm.
reversing America these days, we marry
Hmm.
American
Hmm.
citizen, can stay, right? So at the time, my mother
Yeah.
was 19 years old, and her parents were gone,
Uh-huh.
and she was alone. And so,
Okay.
knowing a native Chinese guy and
Uh-huh.
eventually befriending him and marrying him was one way, as a way of survival. Right?
Sure.
So, but there
Sure.
was
Makes
enough
sense.
true love between two of them, although they were constantly separated because they worked at two different in two different cities at one point, and then of course the Cultural Revolution separated them. By the time when things got better, my mother was on her way returning
Sure.
to America,
Mm.
which she called home, and then
Yeah.
she brought me with her, and then so our family was split in halves, and so
Mm.
I can never imagine how they maintained that relationship over the decades.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. I'm sure it's such a difficult decision for your mom to, in some ways, I mean, it makes sense. Of course, she'd want to return back to her native, or to the U.S. Um, and then, but also have to split her family. And that's almost like a Sophie's choice in some ways, as far as having to choose, what would look like? How, if I may ask, how was that decision even made?
I love the word you use, selfish, and she was. But I think
Well,
at the time, to her defense, she thought she was just going to be repatriated, right? She was an
oh, I
American
see.
citizen,
Okay, yeah,
and
yeah,
she thought within
makes sense.
years, a couple of years, or if not months, the other half of
Yeah.
family would come out. The reason my father and my sister stayed behind is as a promise to the Chinese government that my mother was not going to seek immigration to America. The fact that
Oh,
half the family is still there, it's almost like a hostage, right? For
yeah,
lack of a better word. So obviously,
yeah.
my mother will return to China with me, and of course, so we didn't do any of that. And of course, my mother didn't know that it would take her 18 years to get her American citizenship back. So,
Mm,
and then by then, of course, two halves of family had a complete different
yeah,
lives, right?
yeah, yeah. So it took her 18 years to get her citizenship, even though she already had it?
Well, they didn't recognize her adoption papers that was signed in Shanghai in 1940, although that was a U.S. Supreme Court in Asia, right? So, and then
Yeah.
of course we had a lot of help from our American side of families. We had senators, Congress people helping out, lawyers, and her own determination. Ah,
Yeah.
my goodness, what a journey
Wow.
that was! And that was a set of
Yeah.
challenge that she was not prepared. She was ill
Of course
prepared for.
not.
Yeah.
So she was then treated. How was she treated then when she came to the States? I mean, she spoke. Well, if she hadn't spoken English for quite a while, was her English, her American accent, was it a little? Was it had more of a Chinese influence then?
That's very interesting. So, China after the Cultural Revolution, and then in around 1978 or late 1970s, China reopened to the West, to
Okay.
America. So, a
Okay.
flood of Americans, Westerners visit China, and so it was this
Mm.
physician from Mass General Hospital found my mother and just found her New York accent fascinating, right? Learned about her story and reconnected her to her American family. And then he did make a comment, and it was in the it's in the book. Well, even though you don't have much of an accent, but the level of your speaking is about a junior high level,
Just
which made
interesting.
sense, right? She was 14 years old when her parents
Oh, that
uprooted
makes
her
sense
from
then.
Yonkers,
Yeah.
New York, and brought her took her back to China. And so, yes,
Oh, that makes sense then. That's funny.
but she spoke very well, and which would become a problem for the immigration officers. They
Okay.
couldn't figure out where she learned her English and why she
Yeah.
spoke so well, and that actually hurt her cause. Yeah,
Really?
yeah,
Huh.
mhm,
Interesting.
yeah.
Wow. When she was
Ironic.
connected with your grandparents, her parents, what was that? What was that experience like?
I'm sorry.
When she reconnected with her parents, your grandparents, her
Oh,
parents, what was that like?
my American grandparents passed away in late 1950s and 1960s,
Ah,
respectively. The reason, by the time they adopted my mother, they were well
yeah.
into their 40s and early 50s, so
Oh,
they
okay.
were kind of
Oh gosh.
old already. They were almost like
Yeah. You never got
grandparents,
to see them
you know.
again. Yeah. Oh
Yeah,
yeah. Yeah.
you never saw them again. Yeah, right.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
Oh wow. Did they have relatives? Does she have relatives over there
Yes,
though?
yes, we do.
Okay.
I'm still in
Or you as well?
connection with my American side of heritage, I guess. It's
Oh good.
American side of
Okay.
family. Yes, Mhm.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
helped us immensely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
With your mom having as much resilience as we have, because everyone has a form of resilience. Resilience is like a muscle. The more you get to, more you exercise that muscle, the more resilience you have. And so sometimes people are in situations like yourself, from a young child, finding that resilience much more quickly than other people who haven't been through some traumatic experiences. So when your mom, with the resilience that she had, so she's back in New York, how was she able to then take her life? She had to wait, I guess, 18 years. How was she able to find her way again through all that, to go through the trauma of what happened in China and then to the US? How was she able to navigate life again?
Yeah. I'll have to confess, she didn't do that part very well. She
Okay.
after returning to America in 1980, she essentially spent almost 35 years living in America, right? And again,
Mm.
the immigration process got to her, and then also
Right.
writing her memoir for about 11, 12 years, and got her very depressed at one
Yeah.
point in the 90s. And actually, that led to her early dementia. She died of Alzheimer's
Mm.
in
Mm.
2014. And so
Yeah.
I think what I knew on my mother in those years in early 1980s, like what you said, she was extremely resilient, courageous, and very brave. And this person who was also very hardened by all the things that she had encountered and experienced, right? And then, of course, then later on years, she struggled so much, and I couldn't figure out why she wouldn't be able to handle all this stuff.
Yeah,
Of course,
yeah.
I was, I was being arrogant and naive, both at the same time.
Well,
and until I started working on a memoir, I understood. It was an extremely difficult process for her. Living through those first 50 years of her life in splitting back and forth between America and China, and ultimately returning what she called home, a home that no longer recognized who she was, and a home that was denying her her opportunities and also denying her rights to immigrate. And and she was just like one of these millions of faces and trying to come into this country and take away resources away from people who are already here, right? So I think she ultimately caved in. So.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine. I mean, being under that much chronic stress, and I say chronic stress, it totally minimizes everything you all went through. But the chronic stress component, as far as when a person is the cortisol levels, all these different things when it comes to the fight or flight, when it's constantly there all the time, there's so much stress. And I can imagine when she did get to the States and then thinking it's done, like she's back with her citizenship, and that's not there. I mean, that whole rejection piece there. But I'm assuming like all that, the buildup of all that as well, when she's just kind of collapsed, mentally and figuratively. I'm sure it was just exhausting. I mean, I can't imagine to be there for that long and under that much stress for anyone. And then to come back to
yes.
I mean, it makes perfect sense to me. And so I mean, the fact that if she was still able to be that resilient the rest of her life, like, that's incredible. The fact that she struggled a bit, that's more realistic, I think, for the rest of us. I would struggle myself.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right.
I totally would. Yeah. Wow. Wow. When you tell a story, so I don't know how many shows you've been on, but telling this story to me, what kind of feelings come up for you as you talk about this?
Well, I'm now relieved, right? Because I at least I kept my promise. I finished the book. Two, I learned enormous amount about history and about people and about human nature, right? And about terrible things we can do to one another, and the pain and the collateral damages that these things will bring.
Yes.
And so I just hope, we constantly look back on our own history and say, well, let's not do this again. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Right? So I am very grateful for this process. It's been in some ways, very redemptive for me to do this whole nine yard. Although it didn't start that way, but now I look back on it. Yes, I appreciate the opportunity.
You fulfilled you promised your mother. Congratulations.
Yes.
Unfortunately, Richard, our time is up. I'm so honored and so appreciative that you're on my show today to share your family's history. As you said, there's so many more family members who went through very similar experiences than yours. And thank you for giving them a voice and an opportunity to be able to share their story and your story specifically. So if my viewers and listeners want to find out more information about you and to purchase this book, Spring Flower, where would they find all this information online?
Amazon.com or Barnes Noble. If you just type a Spring Flower Jim Perkins, it will show up. And yes.
Awesome. And your website, what's your website again?
Oh, yes. RichardPHsung.com. My entire name spelled out letter by letter. Mm-hmm.
Awesome. My viewers and listeners also know that if they can't find this information any other place, simply go to the show notes at jamesmiller@lifeology.com, and I'll connect you with Richard and his book, Spring Flower, and all his information that you may want. Richard, thank you so much. I do appreciate all your time and energy.
Thank you so much for having me.